This is the video podcast, or I don't know if it counts as a podcast if there's video involved, but that's what we're going to call it, for the Evangelical Chapter of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy that has been using an easier, more marketable, memorable kind of name, Multifaith Matters, of late. But we're going to talk today a little more about what religious diplomacy is. Even though I use the term multi-faith engagement, what we're really talking about, that process, is one of religious diplomacy. And it never fails when I tell people I do religious diplomacy, they don't know what that is. So I've got a special guest today, the founder and president of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy, Charles Randall Paul. And he's going to help me unpack with a set of questions how this came about, how we started FRD, how we put together a religious diplomacy approach. And then we're going to have a second set of questions where he and I actually put that theory and that strategy into practice and unpack some difficult questions together. So Randy, welcome to the conversation.
It's good to be here, John. Thanks for inviting me.
Sure. You and I have been working together for a number of years with FRD. As I mentioned in the introduction, you're the founder and the president. I head up the Evangelical Chapter and serve on your board. But let's unpack the organization a little bit and that approach. How did you come to develop the idea and the practice of religious diplomacy?
I studied for too many years at the University of Chicago in midlife the question of religious conflict seen from within various religious and philosophical communities. What was the problem of conflict between religions, and how did they frame it and talk about it? And I came to a conclusion that most traditions felt that there needed to be, in good old sociological theory, Georg Zimmel's, theory that whenever a community needed solidity and unity, it found an exterior other, an enemy, or something to challenge it to make the community cohere. And I found that to be typical across all religious communities within the, if you will, the deep mythology of the community. Going back to the LDS community, which I came from, there was a war in heaven. In heaven, by all means, in the presence of God, war. How can that be, right? That was one of my great personal questions, and I concluded that religions actually use conflict or radical difference to establish not only good or evil, but us and them in a sense of higher and lower, to go right to the bottom line, so to speak, to the level of God over humanity. And I came to realize that conflict has its positive uses. It's if you will, it's difference itself. Many people conclude that the ultimate reality is a convergence into a oneness that is inexplicably one. That peace, if you will, is achieved when there is no more difference, when there is no conceivable possibility of conflict, because there's no conceivable possibility of humans having a difference of a view or opinion. They're in now the divine. The other view is that the ultimate is some form of continual, if you will, I like the word fecundity, or growth, or delight in the radical, at some level, radical differences between all beings. And so I went in the direction of a love based on differences versus, and there is a versus in there a little bit, I think, versus a love based on ultimate unity of no difference. And I use the word love there because I come out of a Christian background, and even though some people might not think I'm very Christian due to my LDS background, bear with me on that. if you will, the conclusion of the work was we'd have the wrong idea of peace. Peace is always a state of both joy and tension. And to live in that tension of growth is actually a joyful thing if you love one another. And that is kind of the foundation for what we decided, you and I and others, when we started to put together this organization many years ago. And we actually started in the year 2000 talking about this, that some form of relationship that included the contestation of difference and the collaboration of love had to be the most real expression of what is human in at least in the current sense of humanity. There might be a heaven where there is this convergent oneness, but my belief is, of course, I'm a more of a divergentist, and in my belief, but I'm not going to say that that's the ultimate truth. But at least while we're here on earth, it seems that this is the case, that theologically speaking, God could, if you will, reveal himself in such obviousness to every human being. Every day you could have angelic visitors on every corner of every, it's within God's power. If God reveals himself once someplace, he could do it all the time and everywhere. So the theological theory is there must be some good reason that God is leaving things open to these differences. I'll quote the Quran on this one. It's one of my favorite scriptures. So I'm not a Muslim, but this is a great scripture. It's in the Surah 5, verse 48. If God had desired all humanity to be one, he would have designed us so, but he made us many tribes so that we might vie with each other or compete with each other in righteousness, mm-hmm. and thereby increase the righteousness on the earth. And at the last day, God will make all of our arguments clear. So there's this pragmatic idea there of difference that really tests our love, that can't be rationalized into harmony. It's too easy when we can all harmonize it all and say it's all cool. We're all human beings. We all love our families. We all know we need to help the poor. So why should we argue over anything? Well, that's not the way the world's designed. The world's designed to give us purposes and theologies that are in conflict with each other, that are not compatible. Well, what good is that? Our claim here at the foundation is it brings our hearts and minds to this impossibility of ultimate harmony. And what do we do with that? Do we hate each other? Do we kill each other? Do we diss each other? Or do we continually engage in honest contestation, trying to persuade each other of the truth in an attitude of respect and love? And that's what you and I have done with each other for many years. And that's what diplomacy is versus dialogue. Dialogue is the idea of we're going to sit down and have a mutual understanding. And like the French say, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. If you understand everything, there's really no difference between us that matters. We like to say, when we really understand each other, then we know why we should be having an argument. There are things that are really different, and they both can't be true. And if we think that truth matters, then we should have that honest conversation. I don't like the word argument so much because it has too many negative connotations, but a contestation means to testify. It's not contention. Mm-hmm. It's a mutual testifying where you work out together the truth that you honestly have discovered and continually have that relationship. Anyhow, that was a long answer to your question.
No, that was a good one. It may cover a couple of bases here with some of the other questions, but just for the viewers in clarification, you and I are not on the exact same page in terms of our own religious commitments. And that's, I think, one of the beautiful things about the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. You're a Latter-day Saint. I'm an evangelical. There's a Muslim chapter. We're all committed to the principles and practice of religious diplomacy, but we don't agree. And so we're working.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And we're working together. And so people need to understand that as we have this conversation in this video, we're coming from different places as well. And so we're not going to be saying the same thing. Now, I think you would agree with me on this. I don't like the phrase the discussion about conflict resolution. I think sometimes you can resolve it, but that's not what we're trying to do with the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. It is conflict maintenance, or what's a better term for that? I mean, because if we don't persuade each other, if I don't convince you to become an evangelical and vice versa, and if we don't convince our Muslim friends to become Christians, there's still those deep differences. So what are we aiming for with this approach?
There are 2 or 3 levels on that. I was in an original dialogue with, it happened to be an evangelical. I wasn't in the dialogue, but I'd set it up and we were filming it. And the parties at the end, I'll never forget the evangelical guy, I think it was a Muslim, said to me as we were kind of going out the door, he said, I started out coming here this evening, really assuming that this guy was going to be a jerk and completely benighted, and going to hell. And now I've got to admit, he was an incredible human being, a very intelligent guy. And I felt his love, and it was powerful. And I came in so prejudiced against him that now I'm leaving prejudiced for him. I'm now very sad that he's going to hell.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference.
Right.
That's the difference.
Progress.
It's not that he didn't change his doctrine. He still felt that the man was condemned,
right,
for his belief. But his feeling toward him was so different. He was not about to lie about that guy or wish him any kind of ill will. And that is, I think, the essence of what our diplomacy is about, is we're trying to convert ill will into goodwill. Lying and deception and falsehood into authentic truth, and let it sit out on the table between us. But the goal is, I like to say, it's mutual persuasion, first at the level of hearts, meaning I'm trying to persuade you that I care about you and you care about me, and we both care about God, if it happens to be a theist. And then I want to get to the level of mutual appreciation for what we came, how do I say this? Of how we came to believe what we came to believe. The first question of all of our conversations, John, we start with this one question. If your hearers listen to this, they'll get, I think, what diplomacy is. The question is, how, that the parties share, how did you come to your deepest convictions, your most cherished beliefs or ideals? I don't want you to tell me about them, mm-hmm. but tell me how you came there. And we give each other ample time to tell personal stories. And that gets people, again, to relax a bit and see in the other an intelligent human being with good motives who has come to very different conclusions. And that, again, allows for a deep, then mutually persuasive engagement on doctrines and on different experiences. I know many people could say, well, you've had an experience with God, but it's not the kind of experience that we believe is from God. It's either the devil or some auto-suggestion that you've had through experiences, whatever. That is also part of the critique. that's an honest critique between people, but they can't deny, usually most of our conversations, they don't deny that you had an experience that you sincerely believe, or you've read a scripture that you sincerely believe means this. So that's what we do. We try to bring people to a mutual care for each other, respect for each other's way or journey of getting to where they are. And then we go into a mutually persuasive contestation. We contest where we think the truth lies. And sometimes people change a little bit in their views. I've never seen them so far change completely to convert to another position that is radical. We've written a fun story about two people in this kind of diplomacy who, after 3 years of engagement, happened to be a priest and a mullah, but after 3 years of engagement, every week, one calls the other the night before their weekly meeting and says, "I've got to see you in the morning fast. Something radical's happened." And the other guy says, "I was just about to call you." They sit down at breakfast and say, "Well, you tell me what's going on." He said, "Well, he's a priest." And he says, "I'm going to convert to Islam." You got me. and the mullah, shocked, knocks his head against the chair behind him and says, "I was calling you to tell you I'm going to convert to Catholicism." So in our little story there, that's deep. That's a deep diplomatic engagement that came to unusual ends. And of course, they say, "Well, what do we do? What are we going to tell our communities? I mean, this is a disaster, right?" But we can't not do it because we are now convicted. We got to live with integrity. And they go through various discussions in this little story and how they're going to tell their families and all. And they decide they just have to do it. And as they're going out the door of the restaurant, they say, well, what about us? And the new converts looked at each other and said, "I'll see you next week." And when you catch the meaning of the diplomacy is not to come to a final end. It's an engagement that will never end, because people in their hearts feel a responsibility to share the truth that they really believe. And there is, that's different than dialogue, where people sit back and say, "Okay, we understand each other, and now we go our ways." Diplomacy implies you have a purpose, and that purpose includes persuading the other person to change.
And would you also say that it's different than interfaith, in that, in my experience, in general, there's always exceptions to generalities. Interfaith tends to focus on commonalities. It's work towards common purposes and goals. Persuasion is off the table completely. In fact, I had one extended, heated online conversation years ago with a pagan interfaith individual who accused me of being unethical for trying to, he thought, smuggle this approach into interfaith circles, because it's unethical to try and persuade somebody from an interfaith perspective. So there are commonalities and similarities with dialogue and interfaith, but it's also something very different. Is that correct?
Yes, I think you've said it very well. Interfaith tends to be oriented toward mutual understanding, to do good works in society together, to try to find common areas of overlap in civil society. And I am all for it. It is a great goal, but it isn't sufficient to have what we call heart and mind conversations that allow the wholeness of a person to be put out. All the motives you have are real. One of them is always to persuade someone to change in respect to you. And of course, in our rules of engagement, if you will, we call it the way of mutual openness. But this is not child's play, because you also agree that you are open to be persuaded. You're open. Openness implies you are open to say what is in your heart and mind fully. But it also means you are open to receive what the other person is giving you. And the reason we say it's not for kids is because there is a moment of honesty where there's danger in this kind of engagement. We've got to say if you want to remain just as you are, you should not engage in the kind of heart and mind diplomacy that we're talking about. Because you will be changed in some fashion, even if it's, as I discussed, even if it's your attitude about your opponent or your critic or your rival. If it's merely at an attitude level, still that's a change, and it's a big one in your life. And you could change your views about your religion or that person's religion in certain ways.
Now, we should point out
that it is about change. It is about change.
Although we're talking about religious diplomacy, this is not limited to application in religious contexts. You've used it in others, and we're limited in time. I want to shift gears here in just a moment towards actually practicing some of this by having some conversations about some deep questions. But we are living in a time of extreme polarization, politically, socially, and otherwise. And can you very quickly, we can apply it to these kinds of differences as well, can we not?
Yes, we're writing, a couple of colleagues and I are writing, who have very different religious and political views, by the way. Three of us are writing a book together to prove this in this time of need, from a political standpoint and a social cultural standpoint. We like to say the problem isn't polarization. Polarization is not a problem. Or take that back. Polarization is a continual problem that human beings have. They're always polarized. The distance can be considered, I think, the distance. I don't know if there's a measure for the distance of polarization in the rhetorical world, but I'll just say that's what we are. We are pluralistic beings, and the goal, of course, of our diplomatic teaching is heart and mind. If you can know why your political opponent has come to the position he's come to, or she's come to, you will definitely have, and how they got there, you will definitely have an empathetic, and there'll be an admiration for the other person, having gone through the work of life that person has gone through to come to that position. So the attitudinal change, we believe, is what has to happen for a democratic polity to have the kind of attitude about their opponent that will allow for compromise to occur. Now, speaking of compromise in one word, and I'm not going to belabor this, that has become an anathema. It's like me saying to you, John, you need to compromise your belief in Jesus Christ.
Right.
And see it the way the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints do. That's not going to go down with John Morehead, and nor would I actually ask that.
Right.
But when we're talking politics is the art of the possible, right? It's not the art of the perfection. And so we've got to realize that when we have our ideals that are non-compromisable, in a world where there are conflicting ideals that cannot be harmonized. Remember, that's our background. How do you have any kind of peace exist? Is it always just war? Do you really want to eliminate your enemy? No. In politics, what you do is you have this peaceful tension, as close as you can get by means of compromise, where we believe, on most cases, believers will say that God or the Dharma or whatever they find is the great power understands what our situation is and does not look down on us for compromising, as long as we know that we have made our point extremely clear that this is what we believe and we are in a world of compromise. So with integrity, we have made our points clear. That's what diplomacy is about, is you show people you're not compromising your ideals, but you are compromising in order to get along in the world. And there are points where you can't. And we're not pacifists. So there are points where you can't compromise. Someone's about to shoot you or attack your country. You have possibilities there of violent interaction, of course. But I think abortion is perhaps the biggest case in our country where the beliefs and the need for compromise are at they're at its highest point. And though I don't think you and I are going to discuss that today, that's always a great one to use in diplomacy to show how difficult and yet how necessary it is to compromise in the real world when in your heart you just can't compromise.
Yeah. Hopefully with all that proceeding, folks have a little understanding of what religious diplomacy is about, what the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy is doing. With this video in the notes that describe the program, there will be a link to FRD, and people can go out there and look and see the description. There's some videos that are out there, people engaged in this kind of process across religious traditions. Well, let's shift gears a little bit from talking about religious diplomacy and the organization to practice of it between you and I. You and I exchanged some questions. I don't know what the remaining time that we have left we'll be able to do too many of them, maybe one or two, but we'll give it a shot. So the first one you sent to me, and I think this is a great one because it touches on a lot of the concerns that at least evangelicals and other conservative Christians have. I don't know if it's one that is of great concern to Latter-day Saints. You can let me know. Here's your question you sent to me. Loyalty to God and or to one's faith community is in question when we sincerely open ourselves to influence from, quote, less true, unquote, or false philosophies or religions. Yes or no? It is strange missionary work where the missionary might be the convert after heart and mind influence from critical or outright dark forces. Is this whole thing not theological? Brace yourself, your term here, whoring in the name of loving one's neighbor, right? How would you answer that as a Latter-day Saint? And then I'll give you an evangelical perspective on that.
Yeah, that was a provocative last.
Yes.
But it's very scriptural, That.
There you go.
My short answer is, most Latter-day Saints, from my perspective, have enough confidence in what they believe to be a loving God that they go out with no expectation to be converted to another philosophy when they do their outreach.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even in their mind of possibilities. It has happened, however, but it's very rare. What they do learn is they will come back with different attitudes about the culture that they're in. And by the way, I did some study when I was working on my PhD of Protestant missionaries that went to China, who in the early 20th century came back to their congregations, and they looked down on their congregations as parochial. They didn't lose their faith in Christ or their Presbyterianism, but they certainly saw themselves as now worldly wise because they had seen another culture and they'd come to appreciate it, right? So at least there's that much, there's that change, but I don't think the Latter-day Saints have a fear of being taken down. The Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, I've got to get that back in my term.
That's right.
Terminology. Maybe some of your audience understands what I'm doing here, but the Latter-day Saints often tell the story of Jesus going down among the prostitutes and the tax collectors. That's where he spent his missionary time. And we should do the same thing. We shouldn't fear being exposed to evil. Our goal is to go and, go out to the sick and bring them into the hospital and not worry about getting COVID ourselves, right? That's the way that Latter-day Saints talk about it. Right. How do you guys talk about it?
I think differently. And I think it's because in light of the complexion of American religiosity, your numbers would reflect a minority religious tradition, whereas evangelicalism is much larger. And I think that with the changes from what we could have called in the past a Christendom culture, where traditional Christianity was kind of at the center in terms of credibility and being viewed positively, influencing the culture, the idea that this is a so-called Christian nation, when that shifted towards post-Christendom, where even though we still have a large number of evangelicals, we're now on the margins of culture, not viewed favorably. Our positions in politics are viewed very negatively. With that perception, I think we become more defensive, especially in a post-9/11 environment. There's some fascinating research that's been done on how evangelicals looked at Islam pre and post 9/11. Pre 9/11, Islam was talked about like other religious traditions, a mission field that we need to understand and send missionaries to and reach. Post 9/11, that shifted dramatically. It's sometimes not even viewed as a religion. It's just a political force. It's very dark. It's spiritually evil. In fact, the essence of it is violence. So it shifted quite a bit post 9/11. And I think that that has somewhat influenced the way we tend to view other religious traditions. So evangelicals now have we've always been very strong about our boundaries. And I think that's been strongly reinforced. And so nowadays, when you go out and talk about peacemaking or dialogue or religious diplomacy, you'll get fears of syncretism, the inappropriate combining of different religious ideas and teachings. You'll get a disgust reaction as a means of protecting one's spiritual health, just as we've developed over time ways of being disgusted by foods or disease to keep ourselves physically healthy. As you know, there's also a spiritual contamination fear. And so evangelicals are really dialed down into that. And so then I think because of all those psychological dynamics, then we look to the Bible and we find verses that support that, what fellowship has light with darkness? Can should we be unequally yoked with unbelievers? So you've got us tapping into that part of the biblical tradition, whereas people like myself would look at biblical passages on neighborliness, hospitality, these kinds of things, the example of Jesus with Gentiles and Samaritans. So I think our psychology plays a part, and then we build a theology that really justifies our psychological intuitions, is my theory as to what's going on. So I think I'm at odds. I'm a minority, and those like me working with me in the Evangelical Chapter in terms of how we would understand this process. We don't see a compromise. We believe you can maintain good evangelical convictions and yet love your neighbor and not compromise by going through this process of religious diplomacy.
I remember you once taught me the story of Jesus and the woman of the well, and taught me how that story of being with the Samaritans, with the outsiders, was a very powerful story. I just leave that. We're coming to an end, I think, and I just want to say that it's always both ways. Those of your opponents within your community have a pragmatic truth to what they're doing. We can be contaminated. We all know that, right? That's true too. So one of our methods at the foundation is always to go not either or, but yes and not but just say how are both these realities? How do we wrestle with them and come out with a greater, more powerful truth? And I'm glad you're there with your view. I can only say that we are all called. I think we have to feel like we're called to different callings, and some people are insiders who work hard on maintaining those boundaries, and others are called to be outsiders, to move outside and to bring people in. If you don't go out, you can't bring people in. And so the missionary approach can be kind of an internal missionary approach or an external missionary approach. And I see you taking the external missionary approach and practically doing it in a way that you can have some powerful influence on bringing people in and helping the evangelical community not be a pariah, but shine, the light out under the bushel. And I know your team would probably say the devil's just having a heyday, making you look bad in American politics. But that might be true. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't get out there with your own lights and try your best to outshine the old bad boy. So I appreciate what you just said. Do we have time for another question?
Unfortunately, I don't think we do. But I just want to, I think that's a great note to close on in terms of this concern about contamination and the distinction between intra-faith work and interfaith work. My concern is for the evangelical tribe, primarily. That's why I head up the Evangelical Chapter. I want to help my fellow evangelicals not have this very negative feeling and response towards people in other religious traditions. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them completely, but we can respond to them and interact with them in more positive ways, because we got to share the planet. We have to share our neighborhoods, and we have to figure out these ways to work through these deep differences. And that involves a lot of intra-faith work, so that we can then be prepared to do the interfaith work or the religious diplomacy. And as you pointed out, that means risking mutual contamination. The early Christians responded to the plague in Rome, not by running away, not by protesting their rights, whether or not they had to wear masks, but they ran into the plague and cared for the pagans and demonstrated the love of Christ. They risked contamination. And I think today we have multiple forms of contamination we need to be willing to be risk takers with as evangelicals and others. Any closing thoughts, Randy?
I love that public health analogy you just made. It's so true. I think that was a wonderful way to end it. It is a risk, but let's face it. What is the first principle of Christianity? It's trust in God. They wouldn't ever use the word trust if there weren't a risk.
That's right.
I mean, that word wouldn't exist if everything was locked, trapped, and certain. So I think we get our points in heaven for getting out there and risking the contamination with a heart desiring to love and improve the world.
Again, my guest today is Charles Randall Paul, founder and president of the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. Randy, thank you so much for the conversation. I hope we get to do this again.
I'd love it, John.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
You too.